What if a single insult could shake a nation's political landscape? And what if the person who took the insult wasn't just any leader, but South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol? Yoon Suk Yeol, the current president of South Korea, has quickly become one of the most talked about figures in global politics. Known for his strong stance on law enforcement and national security, he's been making bold decisions that have drawn both praise and criticism. From his tough position on North Korea to his efforts to maintain order in a rapidly changing society, Yoon has been at the forefront of South Korean politics. But what happened when a public insult aimed directly at his leadership and controversial policies rocked him to his core? You won't believe what happened next was a move that shocked the entire world and left many questioning his true intentions. In this video, we're going to uncover the story of how President Yoon Suk Yeol was insulted by someone fiercely opposed to his views on martial law, and what his jaw-dropping reaction was. We'll break down the details of this intense moment and explore why it has the potential to change the future of South Korean politics. Stick with us till the end, because this is a story you don't want to miss, one that reveals not only the power struggle in South Korea, but also the power of a leader facing intense pressure. Welcome to Craze TV, where we bring you the latest political stories with a twist. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and let's dive right into the shocking truth behind Yoon Suk Yeol's controversial moment. Martial law refers to the imposition of direct military control over normal civilian functions of government, often in response to crises like war, natural disasters, or civil unrest. When martial law is declared, normal legal processes and civil rights are suspended, and the military gains the authority to enforce laws, often with more extreme measures than what is allowed under civilian rule. In South Korea, martial law has a deeply significant and controversial history, shaped by the country's turbulent past and struggles with authoritarian rule. South Korea's experience with martial law goes back to its earliest days as a modern state after its liberation from Japanese colonial rule in 1945. In the years that followed, the country faced widespread instability, including the Korean War 19,501,953, which devastated the peninsula. In the aftermath, martial law became a tool for political leaders to maintain order, especially during times of national crisis. However, it was also frequently used to suppress opposition and silence dissent, leading to a legacy of mistrust and fear around the concept of military rule. Perhaps the most infamous chapter in South Korea's martial law history occurred in 1980, when then President Chun Doo-won declared martial law across the country to crush growing student protests and political unrest. This period, known as the Gwangju Uprising, saw the military violently suppress demonstrations in the city of Gwangju, resulting in the deaths of dozens, possibly hundreds of civilians. The brutality of the crackdown and the perceived overreach of martial law left a lasting scar on South Korea's national consciousness. The Gwangju massacre remains a powerful symbol of the dangers of martial law being used as a tool of political repression. This history has shaped the attitudes of many South Koreans towards martial law, creating a deep divide between those who view it as a necessary tool for maintaining national security and those who see it as a dangerous step toward authoritarianism. In a democratic society like South Korea, where freedom of speech and the right to protest are fundamental, the idea of suspending these rights, even in the name of security, is deeply unsettling for many citizens. This is particularly true given the memory of martial law's abuses during the 1980s, when it was used to crush political opposition and silence dissenting voices. The controversial history of martial law in South Korea is an important backdrop to understanding the current political climate under President Yoon Suk Yeol. Since taking office in 2022, Yoon has been at the center of a fierce debate over his policies, especially those related to national security, law enforcement, and government control. His supporters argue that Yoon's tough stance on law and order is necessary to address South Korea's growing security threats, particularly from North Korea and from within the country itself. However, his critics, particularly those on the left, view his policies as authoritarian and reminiscent of the kind of heavy-handed rule that marks South Korea's darker periods in history. Yoon's approach to national security has included a strong focus on military readiness and increased law enforcement powers. He has been vocal about his desire to strengthen South Korea's military alliances, particularly with the United States, to counter the growing threats posed by North Korea's nuclear program. At the same time, he has taken a hardline stance against domestic protests and unrest, deploying law enforcement with increasing authority to quash opposition. For many, this combination of policies bolstered by Yoon's tough rhetoric on security and law enforcement has raised alarms. To some, his actions seem like a return to a more authoritarian style of governance, one that might echo the martial law tactics of the 1980s. There is a growing sense that Yoon's administration is eroding the freedoms South Koreans have fought hard to secure since the end of military rule in the late 1980s. These critics argue that Yoon's policies, while presented as necessary for national security, risk undermining democratic norms by concentrating too much power in the hands of the government and military. This tension between security and freedom is at the heart of the debate surrounding Yoon's leadership. On one side are those who argue that his tough approach is essential for protecting South Korea's interests in a dangerous and unstable region. On the other are those who fear that the government's increasing control over citizens' lives, particularly through law enforcement and military powers, signals a shift toward authoritarianism. It's in this context that the concept of martial law becomes especially fraught, as any move in that direction would be seen by many as a betrayal of the democratic ideals that South Korea has worked so hard to establish. Furthermore, Yoon's policies on martial law and national security have sparked strong opposition among those who lived through the dark days of South Korea's authoritarian past. Many of these individuals view any talk of martial law or expanded military control as a reminder of the trauma they endured during the years of military dictatorship. For them, Yoon's administration is a painful reminder of a time when South Koreans had to fight for their freedom, and they are determined to prevent history from repeating itself. Their resistance to his policies is not just about the present, it is about ensuring that the hard-earned freedoms of South Korea's democracy are not eroded by the very forces that once sought to destroy them. As President Yoon pushes forward with his policies, the debate continues to intensify, with some fearing that his administration is steering the country back toward the kind of authoritarianism that martial law represents. For those who lived through South Korea's martial law era, the idea of military control, even in a limited form, is a chilling thought. Yet for others, Yoon's leadership represents a much-needed strong hand in a time of growing external threats and internal unrest. In the midst of growing public tension over President Yoon Suk Yeol's policies on martial law and national security, an incident occurred that would stir the political landscape of South Korea. It was at a public event, a rally, where President Yoon was giving a speech to a crowd of supporters. The atmosphere was charged with people eagerly listening to the president's words about strengthening the nation's defense and combating growing threats, both external and domestic. But amidst the applause and cheers, one individual stood out, a man who would disrupt the event with a challenge that would not just insult the president, but ignite a firestorm in the media. This man, who had long been an outspoken critic of Yoon's policies, particularly his stance on martial law, stood up in the middle of the president's speech. With the eyes of the crowd and cameras focused on him, he shouted loudly, calling Yoon a tyrant and accusing him of pushing the country back toward the era of military dictatorship. His words were sharp and direct. "You are no different from the leaders who crushed our freedoms in the past. Your policies will destroy the democracy we fought for." The crowd fell silent for a moment, caught off guard by the audacity of the outburst. The insult was not just a general criticism of his policies, it was deeply personal, attacking the very core of Yoon's leadership and suggesting he was betraying the democratic ideals that South Korea had fought so hard to protect. Yoon, taken aback for a brief second, quickly regained his composure. His face showed a mix of surprise and controlled anger. The president paused for a moment, scanning the crowd, his eyes locking with those of the protester. The tension in the air was palpable. A single misstep could lead to chaos. The man's words had not only challenged Yoon's policies, but had also accused him of undermining the very foundation of South Korean democracy. It was clear that the president was no stranger to criticism, but the raw emotion in the protester's words seemed to hit a nerve. For a moment, Yoon's leadership was being questioned, not just by political opponents, but by someone who represented a deep-seated fear among the public, the fear of returning to an authoritarian past. The man's voice was filled with a sense of urgency, as though he feared Yoon's leadership would lead the country back into the darkness of martial law and military control. The public reaction to this insult was immediate. As the protesters' words echoed in the air, there was a collective sense of discomfort. Some in the crowd felt a rush of sympathy for the protester who had dared to challenge the president so openly. Others, however, stood firm in their support of Yoon, shouting down the protester and insisting that the president was acting in the best interests of the country. The emotions in the crowd were divided, but one thing was certain: the incident had struck a chord. The media quickly picked up on the event, and the story of the public insult spread like wildfire. Headlines across the nation were filled with dramatic portrayals of the confrontation. Some outlets painted the protester as a brave hero, standing up for democracy, while others depicted him as an instigator of chaos attempting to undermine the authority of the president. For the next few days, news stories, opinion pieces, and televised discussions focused heavily on the incident. The focus, however, shifted quickly from the protester's message to Yoon's response. What had he done in the face of this public insult? How would he, a man who had made bold, sometimes controversial decisions about national security, handle being called a tyrant in front of his supporters? The media, both domestic and international, began to speculate about the potential political ramifications of the outburst. Would Yoon react aggressively, using state power to silence the protester? Or would he choose to respond with measured calm, showing his commitment to the democratic principles that his critics believed he was threatening? Behind the scenes, Yoon's advisors were in damage control mode, trying to manage the fallout from the incident. They knew that this was not just a simple protest, it was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the president's policies. The words of the protester, accusing Yoon of undermining the democratic freedoms that South Koreans had fought for, had deep resonance with a public still haunted by memories of authoritarian rule. In the eyes of many, the outburst symbolized a larger fear that martial law policies could once again be used as a tool of political repression. As the story continued to unfold in the media, the question of how Yoon would respond became even more pressing. Would his actions in the days following the insult confirm or dispel the fears that the protester had voiced? Would he take the opportunity to silence his critics, or would he confront the issue head-on, showing the nation that he was willing to listen to dissent even when it came from the most unexpected places? The public debate raged on, with some claiming that the incident was proof of the deep divisions in South Korean society, where fears of authoritarianism still lingered. Others argued that it was a natural expression of free speech in a democracy. But one thing was certain: the insult and the president's response would continue to be a topic of heated discussion for weeks to come. The event had gone beyond a simple protest. It had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle between South Korea's past and its future, a future that many feared was being threatened by the president's policies on martial law. In the face of the public insult, President Yoon Suk Yeol's response took everyone by surprise. Instead of using his presidential authority to silence the protester or call for police intervention, Yoon did something no one expected. He paused for a long moment, his gaze steady, and then addressed the crowd. In a calm yet firm tone, he acknowledged the protesters' words, stating that he understood the concerns raised about his policies and the fear of authoritarianism that still lingered in the nation's memory. Rather than brushing off the insult or responding with anger, Yoon chose to address the underlying issue, the fear of martial law and the possibility of returning to an authoritarian regime. Every voice in a democracy is important, even those who disagree with me, Yoon said, his voice carrying over the crowd. I will not ignore those who challenge me. Our democracy depends on open dialogue, not just on support, but on criticism as well. His words were not just an attempt to defuse the immediate tension. They were a calculated effort to show his commitment to democratic principles even when faced with personal attack. The crowd, initially tense, seemed to soften at his words. Some applauded, impressed by his composure and willingness to engage with criticism in such a public setting. But others were left shocked and confused, unsure of how to interpret his decision to address the issue so openly. For Yoon's supporters, the move was a shock. Many had expected him to respond with authority, perhaps by having the protester removed or even arrested. Instead, his calm demeanor and open acknowledgement of the protesters' words struck them as unusual, even if admirable. They saw it as a sign that their president was committed to listening to all voices, no matter how uncomfortable the message might be. But there was also a sense of unease. Was Yoon showing weakness? Was he uncertain of his power? His decision not to respond forcefully was seen by some as a potential loss of control, especially in a country with a history of leaders using strong measures to quell dissent. Yoon's political opponents, however, saw the response through an entirely different lens. They quickly pounced on his decision, calling it a sign of desperation. Critics argued that by publicly acknowledging the protester, Yoon was undermining his own authority and weakening the message of strength and leadership he had been trying to project. They claimed that his calm reaction only fueled the perception that he was struggling to maintain control, giving his detractors ammunition in their ongoing battle against his policies. For them, this was proof that Yoon was not as strong as he appeared to be, that his presidency was being questioned even by the people who had once supported him. The general public was divided. Some saw Yoon's response as a demonstration of maturity and political wisdom. By choosing to acknowledge the protester without escalating the situation, Yoon had shown a side of him that wasn't just a tough leader, but a leader who understood the importance of transparency and listening to dissent. Others, however, were skeptical. Was this a clever political maneuver, or was it a sign of weakness? Could Yoon, who had been so adamant about national security and law enforcement, truly afford to appear conciliatory in such a charged moment? The uncertainty surrounding his response left many wondering if he had made the right choice. International observers also took note of Yoon's reaction. The event quickly became a talking point in foreign media, with some seeing his handling of the situation as a sign of strength in an era when global leaders are often criticized for being too authoritarian or out of touch with their citizens. Yoon's decision to publicly engage with the protester was seen by some as a rare moment of humility, demonstrating that he was willing to face criticism head-on rather than retreat into the safety of political power. Others, however, questioned whether his response would damage his leadership. In countries with a history of authoritarian leaders, such a display of openness in the face of public insult might have been seen as a potential crack in the armor, a moment of vulnerability that could be exploited by both political adversaries and enemies abroad. What made this response so shocking wasn't just the content of Yoon's words, but the very nature of the response itself. In a world where political leaders often respond to challenges with defiance, aggression, or even force, Yoon's choice to take a different path was both unexpected and unprecedented. It was not typical political behavior, especially for a leader known for his firm stance on national security and law enforcement. Instead of shutting down dissent or using his power to suppress the protesters' message, Yoon chose to confront the issue with a level of calm that defied the expectations of both his supporters and critics. This action sparked intense debate. For some, it was seen as a sign of strength. Yoon had the courage to face the criticism head-on, showing that he was unafraid of dissent and willing to engage in the kind of dialogue that democracy demands. He seemed to acknowledge that no leader, no matter how powerful, could ignore the concerns of the people. For others, however, it appeared to be a moment of weakness, a sign that the president was unsure of his own leadership and that his position was less secure than it had been just days before. In their view, this was not the way a strong leader should act, especially not a leader dealing with one of the most controversial political issues in recent South Korean history. As the incident unfolded, it became clear that Yoon's response would not only affect his standing within the country, but also shape the narrative surrounding his leadership for months to come. The shocking nature of his response, coupled with the deep emotional reactions it provoked, left everyone questioning what it really meant to lead South Korea in a time of such political division. Was Yoon's decision to publicly address the insult a sign of wisdom, or was it a desperate attempt to hold on to power at a time when his authority was being openly challenged? In the aftermath of President Yoon Suk Yeol's unexpected response to the public insult, the political landscape in South Korea shifted in ways that neither he nor his supporters could have anticipated. Initially, the president's decision to address the protesters' challenge with calm composure seemed to have a mixed impact. On one hand, some segments of the public were impressed by his maturity and willingness to engage with criticism. These individuals saw Yoon's reaction as a sign of strength, a demonstration that he was not only confident in his leadership, but also open to dialogue, even with those who opposed his policies. In their eyes, this could signal a turning point for his administration, a moment where he seemed to connect with ordinary South Koreans who were deeply concerned about the future of their democracy. However, the positive reactions were tempered by backlash from others who viewed the president's response as a sign of weakness. Political opponents quickly seized on the moment to argue that Yoon's reluctance to take a firm stand or act aggressively had undermined his authority. Critics claimed that his calm response was indicative of a leader who was losing control over both his party and the political climate. For these detractors, this incident represented an opportunity to challenge his legitimacy, painting him not as a resolute leader, but as one who was unsure of his role in a country still haunted by memories of authoritarian rule. Publicly, the event sparked a heated debate. Protests broke out in several cities, with groups both for and against Yoon's policies voicing their opinions more loudly than ever. Supporters rallied behind the president, believing that his words demonstrated a commitment to democratic principles. Meanwhile, those opposing his stance on martial law used the moment as proof that his policies were pushing South Korea closer to the type of military rule they feared. In particular, the question of whether Yoon's administration would take a more authoritarian turn became a topic of intense speculation. Following the incident, President Yoon and his administration moved quickly to address the fallout. Within days, a series of speeches and public appearances were scheduled in an effort to reassure the public and his supporters that he remained committed to the values of democracy, even in the face of intense criticism. His team crafted messages emphasizing the importance of maintaining national security, while reiterating his position that martial law would only be considered in extreme situations. At the same time, there were hints that some policy changes might be coming in response to the backlash, particularly in areas related to civil liberties and government transparency. However, these changes, while seemingly aimed at addressing the concerns of his critics, did little to ease the deeper divisions in the country. The public response to these policy shifts was far from unanimous. Some saw Yoon's efforts to amend certain aspects of his approach as a sign of political flexibility, suggesting that he was willing to listen to the concerns of the people and adapt accordingly. Others, however, believed that these adjustments were merely a political maneuver, a temporary effort to quell unrest, without addressing the root issues that had caused the public outcry in the first place. The ongoing tension between those who supported Yoon's stance on national security and those who feared his authoritarian tendencies only grew more pronounced. The long-term impact of this event on South Korea's political landscape was significant. While the immediate aftermath involved a flurry of public reactions, the incident left a lasting imprint on the way people viewed both Yoon and the broader issue of martial law. For many, the episode reinforced their fears about the potential for authoritarianism in the country, further polarizing public opinion. Political opponents emboldened by the controversy continued to challenge Yoon's leadership at every turn, amplifying their warnings about the dangers of martial law and the erosion of democratic freedoms. At the same time, however, the event opened up a conversation about the role of democracy in South Korea's evolving political system. The incident highlighted the delicate balance between national security and individual freedoms, a conversation that had been gaining traction even before the protesters' outburst. The public's reaction to Yoon's handling of the situation became a kind of referendum on the future direction of the country. Would South Korea continue down the path of democracy, or would it begin to flirt with the type of authoritarianism that had scarred its past? In the long run, the event also changed how people viewed President Yoon. While he had previously been seen as a strong, decisive leader, his handling of the insult gave many the impression that he was less certain about his vision for South Korea's future. His willingness to acknowledge the protesters' criticisms, while admirable to some, was interpreted by others as a sign of vulnerability. This shift in perception affected his political standing, as both his supporters and opponents began to reassess his leadership style in light of the controversy. For Yoon, the long-term consequences of the incident would not only influence his political career, but also shape the trajectory of South Korea's political future. His handling of the situation revealed a new layer to his leadership, one that was less about unyielding authority and more about engaging with public sentiment, even if that meant confronting uncomfortable truths. Whether this approach would ultimately strengthen or weaken his presidency remained to be seen. What was clear, however, was that the event had brought South Korea's divided political landscape into sharper focus, revealing the deep tensions that still existed between those who feared the return of martial law and those who believed in the necessity of strong, even authoritarian leadership in times of crisis. As the months went by, this incident would become one of the defining moments of President Yoon's tenure. The way he handled the protest and the subsequent reactions from the public and his political opponents would continue to resonate throughout his time in office, leaving an indelible mark on South Korea's political discourse. To wrap up, the public insult directed at President Yoon Suk Yeol was a pivotal moment in South Korean politics. The protesters' harsh words accusing Yoon of pushing the country toward authoritarianism set the stage for an unexpected reaction. Instead of responding with anger or force, Yoon chose to calmly acknowledge the criticism, emphasizing the importance of democracy and open dialogue. This response shocked both his supporters and critics, raising questions about his leadership and the direction South Korea might take in the future. The political fallout from this incident has been significant. While some viewed Yoon's reaction as a sign of strength and wisdom, others saw it as a sign of weakness. His response has sparked a deeper conversation about the balance between national security and democratic freedoms, leaving a lasting impact on public opinion and political discourse in South Korea. So, did this event help or harm President Yoon's political career? It's too soon to say, but what's clear is that his actions will shape the conversation about leadership in South Korea for years to come. Will he be able to restore confidence in his vision? Or will this moment become a symbol of political vulnerability? Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more insightful content. Thank you for watching.